I've been wondering this week which side I would have chosen when the 15th Amendment was being debated in our country. The 15th Amendment, for those of us who don't remember, prohibits the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. I found myself wondering what kinds of conversations my friend, Dr. Willie Parker, and I would have had back then, almost 150 years ago. The 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd, 1870, a year after the end of the Civil War, as the third and last of the Reconstruction Amendments. The first two Reconstruction Amendments abolished slavery, the first one, and then provided citizenship and equal protection under the law to all former slaves. Seems like a no-brainer, still I wonder. Do you know why? Because the 15th Amendment granted black men, but not black women, the right to vote. The amendment granted black men and no women, black or white, the right to vote. And I would have been arguing passionately for my rights. I imagine Dr. Willie would have been arguing persuasively for his right to vote. And I, for mine. What right do you have to vote when I'm still denied? I hear myself saying rather insistently. Fight with us on this one, Barbara, and we will fight for you when the time comes, I hear Dr. Willie saying firmly in response. Of course, this wasn't an academic exercise for Susan B. Anthony or for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper when the amendment was actually being fiercely debated in this country. Susan B. Anthony was white, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was black. As the leader of the colored branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union fighting for the abolition of slavery and for voting rights for women, Frances Ellen agonized over whether to support an amendment that enfranchised black men but denied women. Very active with the Unitarians at the time because they supported the abolition of slavery, she struggled to decide, knowing it could deeply divide black and white women in the suffrage movement. And yet she finally decided to support the 15th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, however, did not. For the next 20 years, the women's suffrage movement was divided and weakened by the issue of race. Which is why I wonder today if I would have seen Dr. Willie's right to vote tied up with my own freedom or not. But fear not, Susan B. Anthony was not a racist. Raised a Quaker in Rochester, New York, she joined the local Unitarian church because they supported the anti-slavery movement, while her Quaker fellowship did not. Liberty, equality, humanity, and justice are engraved into the stone monument to her family in Mount Hope Cemetery and are a summary, really, of her religious convictions. In a journal, she wrote, "Quilted all day, but sewing seems no longer my calling. Fitted out a slave for Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman today." When Susan B. spoke at a Sons of Temperance meeting, at which no woman had ever spoken before, they reprimanded her, and she promptly stormed out, several women following her. It was her first spontaneous protest action. Afterwards, she spoke of being impatient with the white Orthodox male saints. From then on, she regularly practiced civil disobedience, voting in the presidential election of 1872, 48 years before women got the vote. She was arrested and tried in court for that. With Universalist Clara Barton, Susan B. formed the second Red Cross chapter in the country. Susan B. Anthony opposed capital punishment, defended John Brown, who led a slave rebellion, criticized men for trying to control the women's movement, and got into trouble for harboring the abused wife of Massachusetts Senator Phelps. "Trust me," she said, "that as I ignore all law to help the slave, so I will ignore it all to protect the enslaved woman." So despite her unwillingness to support the 15th Amendment, we can see how Susan B. Anthony evolved, taking her own experiences of being marginalized or othered and using it to understand the oppression of others. She knew what it felt like to be excluded, told to sit down, shut up, get out, stay behind. She knew what it felt like to be told, you're not like us, you're not one of us, you're not as smart, not as strong, you're not good enough, you're deficient, you're less than. Her anger and her empathy and her guilt were the three fuels she poured into the engine that drove her work for more justice for everybody. But she still didn't support the 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote before women. She knew how oppressions are all linked, and because she saw how oppressions overlap and intersect, she moved from being motivated by personal concern for the slave as a fellow human being to challenging the systems that created the injustices in the first place. She developed a political consciousness of the economic powers that enforced slavery, and so she fought not only for her rights and other people's rights, she fought for the reform of the systems themselves. And still, she didn't support the 15th Amendment. Her refusal must have been partly strategic, politically strategic, but I can imagine, because of my own experience, it was also because the amendment excluded her and the women she represented. It seems that even when we know that our destinies are intertwined, even when we know that we share the same beginning and ending, no matter what our childhood faith taught us about who was going to heaven and who was going to hell, even though we know we are inextricably caught up in a network of mutuality and that none of us will be free, whole, and empowered until all of us are free, whole, and empowered, we forget this fact, either because of how uncomfortable it is or how inconvenient it is. Or we disagree on the strategy, we disagree on how to get there to more liberty and justice for all, and so we stay divided. But a house divided cannot stand, said Abraham Lincoln in 1858. This morning, we could talk at length about how identity politics and moral politics divide or unite us from many, many different perspectives. We would all have a different personal story to tell, but since America is once again engaged in a profound conversation about race, I want to talk to you this morning about what it means to be white in America today. It has always mattered, but whiteness has mattered more at two particular moments in history. First, whiteness mattered mightily when we debated fiercely with one another about ending slavery and what rights freed slaves would be granted after our Civil War during the first Reconstruction. And second, whiteness mattered mightily again when we debated fiercely about the integration of our schools and voting rights in the civil rights era of the 1960s during the second Reconstruction. So the fact that we are once again fiercely debating about the tenacious impact of racism on our systems of law enforcement, of incarceration and immigration, of education and the environment, of workers' rights and women's rights, points to our being right now in what the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber calls a third Reconstruction. And just as in each of the two other periods, we are being asked to reconstruct America, to reimagine what our lives as Americans looks like and feels like. The reimagining requires that we learn new ways of seeing each other and of being together. I want to make this very clear this morning. As the demographics change, as our nation becomes less and less white, with skin tones as varied as the beverages we find in fancy coffee shops, cafe con leche, cafe crema, flat white, chai latte, cafe cubano, Turkish coffee, egg coffee, coffee with tea, coffee milk, no milk, I like mine black, mocha, mocha latte, mochaccino, macchiato, and more. White Americans need to start studying the history of race and racism in America, and we especially need to start learning about our own color, which is white. For example, I've practiced saying, I'm white. If you are too, I invite you to say it aloud with me now, all together. I'm white. We need to start learning about our own color and what it means. It's taken me years to say that out loud, I'm white, and not feel really uncomfortable. I don't know how you felt. I finally figured out why. There were two reasons, mainly. First, because growing up, I learned that white was the absence of color, and that the black people had color, but not us. We didn't. We were colorless. Second, because when I let myself be aware that I was white and had opportunities and things other people didn't have because they weren't white, I felt ashamed of being white. So I didn't want to talk about it for that reason. I didn't want to talk about race, but that's not exactly it, I've discovered. More precisely, I didn't want to talk about my own color, my own whiteness. Because I was raised a Unitarian Universalist, I've always been pretty comfortable talking about race, the idea of race and the history of racism. I was even taught as a child to treat everybody the same way, taught the history of racism and colonialism, taught not to be a racist. But what I've learned over the last 6 years here at All Souls is that no one taught me how to be conscious of or take responsibility for my own whiteness. It's still difficult to talk about, but I'm going to try this morning anyway. In one of the first Rewire groups I participated in, I've been in about 5, I think now, the last few as a facilitator, and I'm always learning new things in each and every session. In that Rewire group, as I listened to others talk about it, I realized that the times I've been threatened by men, the men weren't black. What does that have to do with anything? You may be asking yourself. Well, most white women, if we're honest, remember times we've either crossed the street or locked our car doors or pulled our purses a little more closely towards us when we've seen a black man. I bet there's not a black man in this congregation who can't tell you a dozen or more stories or more of experiencing this exchange himself. It can't be that it's just those other white women who were doing this. It has to be us. But because we were overcoming our shame about it, our whiteness, by talking about our whiteness, I was able to realize that I've had men grab me, say rude things to me, one even assaulted me, but they were all white. So I started questioning my bias and exploring where it came from. Since it didn't come from direct experience or my family, it had to come from somewhere else. Slowly, I saw that the source of my bias and fear was simply the general narrative from the dominant culture projected in news stories, movies, and television shows without any historical context or critical interpretation, so that despite my open-minded education and liberal religious upbringing, I too had internalized the story that black people were usually poor, often used drugs, and that in general, black men were dangerous. Seeing my own prejudice and being able to tell my own story without the fear of being judged or shamed gave me the space to examine my thoughts and dig into my own subconscious. I began to see things differently. I saw that my life is full of black men, big, bad, black dudes who love me and would protect me with their life if they saw me in harm's way, without hesitation. Since my fears weren't reasoned or reasonable, I decided to retrain my mind and started to intentionally rewire my racial consciousness, literally. When I saw a black man in the park, or a black youth wearing a hoodie, or a black young man walking down the middle of the street in my neighborhood, instead of allowing my heart to speed up and my body to tense up, I started instead to think about JoJo, or David Smith, or Walter Armstrong, or any number of people who I know and love who are big and black, like Dr. Willie Parker. People who've never been violent in their lives and who would never hurt anybody intentionally. And I noticed that my heart slowed down and my body relaxed, and I smiled. With time, I've stopped having the unconscious or subconscious and physically patterned response that was imprinted on me so long ago, which is amazing. Whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not, our prejudices and biases are the air we breathe, the water we swim in, no matter what color our skin is. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility. Because as Martin Luther King said 50 years ago, when evil men conspire to preserve an unjust status quo, good men must unite to bring about the birth of a society undergirded by justice. The committed white liberal must see the need for powerful antidotes to combat the disease of racism. Since good and evil are our theme for the month of October, thank you, Tanner, I returned to my books and rediscovered that an early Christian understanding of evil is that it is only the absence of good. We have Augustine, St. Augustine, to thank for that. Gandhi himself, a student of Christianity, wrote, "We should always try to overcome evil by good, anger by love, untruth by truth. There is no other way of purging the world of evil." When we do start to dig, to see and sift through, to examine our reactions and responses like archaeologists looking for evidence of systemic racism buried beneath layers of politeness and political correctness, how we are in the world changes, and our actions can become a force for good. We can fill the spaces that could be filled with evil, but they can't be because now they're filled with good. For example, Lisa Schatz, the chair of our Justice Council who gave me permission to share this story, is white. She was raised in Tulsa and is in a Rewire group right now. She's been a teacher in one of Tulsa's underfunded public schools with majority brown and black children for many, many years. A few weekends ago, she was on her way to Oklahoma City and she saw 7 cars pulled over by police on the side of the highway, and she noticed, because she's paying attention to race these days, that every single driver was black. As we were processing together the impact of the police shootings on our members, white and black, Lisa said, white and black and brown, Lisa said, "I'm thinking of stopping from now on and pulling out my phone so I can start filming." Another white woman in the circle thanked her for mentioning something so concrete that she might also choose to do. Then in that same circle, a black woman member shared that white members of this congregation ignore her hellos in the parking lot as she makes her way into the building on Sunday mornings. Not just once, but over and over again, she said. What would you say, as you started to shake your head and feel sad, when another black member in the circle said it happens to him all the time too, and that he's even seen white women members clutch their purses to their side when he walks by them in the parking lot, not just once, but time and time again. Here at All Souls. After saying, "I'm so sorry," you might want to use this line. We are waking up to what it means to be white. White America is waking up. I am waking up. I'm sharing these stories with you this morning, not to shame you. Shame is not helpful. But so that you will know without a doubt that your presence here and your responses here and everywhere are very, very important. I want you to know that every time you smile, shake a hand, say hello, offer a hug, you are making a difference, a significant difference. I'm sharing these stories because I hope this Thursday evening you'll attend our community forum on racism and being part of the solution. What are white people to do? All Souls has been known as the conscience of Tulsa before, and it's our time again. If you identify as white, I hope you'll sign up in the foyer today to participate in a Rewire group. These days, when I'm out at night or walking alone, I still evaluate men and assess whether they are a danger to me or not. Until violence against women decreases significantly, I must. But darker skin is no longer a part of my evaluation. Neither are tattoos or cowboy hats and boots or saggy pants and hoodies. More recently, in a real, not imaginary conversation with my big black dude friend, Dr. Willie Parker, he said, men have to realize that patriarchy costs us something as well. In speaking out on behalf of women's freedom and agency, I'm not just being a good dude. I'm not being benevolent. I'm being self-interested by saying if a system costs me part of my humanity, I'd better be vested in dismantling that system. To which I replied, that's the beautiful yin-yang of our relationship. As a white woman, I could easily ignore racial oppression and the history of slavery in this country, but I can't do that because it compromises my humanity. The more people we get to know, the more stories we listen to and integrate, the more history we learn, the less afraid we become, the more free we are. It has been painful to discover that even I, raised in this righteous faith with examples like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Susan B. Anthony to guide me, also make assumptions based on prejudice and bias. But hating it isn't enough. Covering it up just makes me complicit. Shame only keeps us quiet. Evil is only the absence of good. And good women and men are the only ones who can stop evil from spreading. The more I invest in you, being all of who you are with all the same rights and responsibilities, the more free I am, the freer we all are because of our religious ancestors who fought for the freedom to believe as they saw fit. We also know that no good man or woman wants to be in a heaven above to gaze down forever upon the bad people eternally suffering in hell, because that heaven really sounds like hell. We know the only heaven we're ever sure to experience is the one we create right here, by extending the same dignity and respect, the same human and civil rights to each and every body, no matter who they are, gay or straight, rich or poor, Democrat or Republican, black or brown, indigenous or immigrant, employed or unemployed, military or civilian, white or yellow, disabled or able-bodied, queer or trans, documented or undocumented, very old or very young. Your challenges are my challenges are your challenges. The temptation to stay divided threatens our future, our families, and our future, and our freedom. Evil is that which annihilates, hampers, or hinders life. Good is the saving or serving of life, enabling it to attain its highest development. Today, after Terence Crutcher's death, more than 100 years after local police were primarily used to enforce racism and segregation here in Tulsa, with extreme acts of violence sometimes, the authorities in this city are talking about creating a new Citizens Advisory Board to work with the Tulsa Police Department. I think we can win that fight if we stand united. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper chose the fight she could win at the time. I wish Susan B. Anthony had stood united with her. We must not allow ourselves to be tempted to turn away from each other's pain and suffering. We must resist the forces that would divide us: shame, depression, blame, denial, apathy, skepticism, or even worse, cynicism. It's tempting to turn away. It's tempting to cross the street, to protect our purses, to drive on by. It's easier to enjoy our lives the way they are and pretend we're colorblind, that we're not colored too, so we don't have to feel the pain of our own prejudices. But then we're choosing to stay in chains and in a prison of our own making. We who are white and who know we've been granted every right without having to fight for it have a responsibility now, if not to fight on behalf of others, at least to explore the meaning and impact of our own whiteness on our own relationships, our own families, our country, and our community here. It's important work, and only we can do it. We can't wait for a great leader or a savior to come and rescue us because they're not running this year. So as Colin Kaepernick said after watching the first presidential debates, let's make America great for the first time. Because we know a house divided against itself cannot stand, and we know goodness depends on people, real people, we, the people of all souls, and we, the people of these United States of America. Amen.
We are your church, and we are proud to be your church, or at least a church that's having a positive impact on your life. I am personally blessed to be your minister, or at least a minister who you're allowing to speak into your life. I hope you'll support our ministry and share your love beyond belief by texting LOVE-BB to 41444 or go to our website. But you can just text LOVE-BB to 41444 and make your gift. It's wonderful. Thank you. Be blessed and be a blessing.